Hello and welcome to a video on test anxiety and studying for tests. We're going to start by just talking about anxiety and the origins of anxiety. And I'm going to read a little quote by this author, Mo Gaudat, who's the author of a book called Solve for Happy. And he tells us that at the root of our challenging relationship with our own brains is the fact that it is a device that was assembled, tested, and mostly completed hundreds of thousands of years ago in a vastly different environment with vastly different requirements. Because of its evolutionary origins, the world your brain deals with is ancient, murky, and terrifying. So are its strategies. If we're to use this device properly, we need to adapt its programming to match its new operating environment. The world we live in is relatively new for these brains that we've had adapted. And 10,000, 100,000 years ago, when our brains were developed, they were developed to keep us safe. Their main job was to keep us safe. The hunters, the gatherers, keep us safe. And so this origins of anxiety comes from the fact that our brains are there to keep us safe. So our brains work like a diligent lawyer. Your brain often looks for what might pose a threat. That's its job. Why would it do otherwise when its sole purpose in life is to protect you? Imagine if the conversation of an ancient hunter 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago went like this. Chill, there are no tigers around here. Don't even bother checking. Walk into that cave. You'll be just fine. Obviously, a certain amount of anxiety was important to keep that hunter safe from the dangers that lurked around. So that's why it often behaves like a diligent lawyer would. Think about what a lawyer does. Given the task of protecting your business from every possible attack, good lawyers will write hundreds of pages of contracts and legal documents that anticipate every little thing that could possibly go wrong, when in fact, most of it will never even happen. But the lawyer has to think of all the possibilities that might go wrong. And our brain does the same thing. And oftentimes that pushes us into a state of anxiety. How do you feel when you take a test? When you're the first time you see it, does it look like this? And then after your professor corrects it, you look at it and all of a sudden it makes sense. Like, how it didn't make sense when I was in this state of anxiety. And then all of a sudden after the test, then I'm like, what? How come I didn't mark those correct? Or do you ever feel like you've finished studying, you go into the test and your mind's been wiped clean? If you do, you might have an overwhelming amount of anxiety that's above a normal amount. So here are some questions you can ask yourself. When taking tests or quizzes, do you experience anxiety that affects your performance? After leaving the test environment or when it's returned, do you wonder why you chose an incorrect answer when you knew the correct one? Do you change or second guess your answers? Do you get answers incorrect when you do this? Do you go blank or become so overwhelmed that you have trouble thinking through questions to come up with the answers? Do you feel very panicky when you take an important test? If you answered yes to any of these questions, you might be experiencing an overwhelming amount of test anxiety that's above the normal amount of anxiety that brains are meant to deal with. We want to let you know that we have at Salt Lake Community College have a Disability Resource Center called the DRC. They can give you options if you have documented anxiety. Some accommodations often include extended testing time, minimal distraction environment. Sometimes students might qualify for a reader or a scribe. So that's a resource we want to make sure you're aware of. You can get more information here at this website, slick.edu/DRC. Let's move on to part 2, which is test preparation. Do you ever find yourself saying something like, I feel like I spent a decent amount of time on homework, I take good notes, but nothing really seems to be working. I feel like for the most part, I understand the material, but I'm not able to perform on tests. It's a common struggle we hear from students. Well, in the test preparation category, I like to bring up this quote: planning is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now. If you know you have anxiety, one of the big things you can do is to plan and bring the future into the present, do something about it now before you get there. So what to do to prepare for tests? Here are a few ideas. Begin studying early. Do tricky practice problems repeatedly. Do them once a day. Help other students with homework if you can. Explaining to others can help you remember the material. Find a group of students or study buddies to work with. As long as they're not distracting you, that can be a great way to practice problems and explain to others. Make notes on difficult problems as you do your homework to ask your teacher about. Make sure you're writing your homework out. Make sure you're making your own, write down your questions so that when you get to your teacher, you can ask them about those questions. Oftentimes students say, I had a question in the homework, but they didn't write it down. When they get to class that next day, they can't really remember what that question was. It's really important to write it down. That's, believe it or not, part of studying is the homework process. Make flashcards for vocabulary words or any other thing that you might have to memorize. Just bring those flashcards around with you everywhere you can. Ask questions in class when confused and write down your answers in the notes. Maybe have a separate section in your notes where you have a question and answer section where when you had a question, you write it down, because if you think you'll remember it, you probably won't later on. So it's important to write those things down and come back to them as you study. Discuss homework problems with classmates before class if you're sitting around waiting for class to start. If your exam will be timed, which most of them are, make sure you to practice doing problems in a timed setting. That will kind of increase your anxiety a little bit while you're doing the problems on your own and put you in that setting where you're training your brain how to recall the right information when you're kind of have this heightened anxiety. So setting a timer and seeing if you can do a problem on your own is a great way to practice problems before a test. Find creative ways to organize your notes that make them easy to look back on. Here's a little pre-test checklist as we get closer to the test. Organize all your material on the exam the night before so that you don't have to worry about that stuff the day of. Prepare your body for battle. Get a good night's sleep. Eat a proper meal. You're asking your body and your brain to be in peak performance, so you control the most important elements for making this happen. Physical activity can help burn off adrenaline. You might have an increased amount of adrenaline going into the test. If you can run up and down a few stairs before starting it, if you can do some jumping jacks, this physical activity can help the body process that chemical release of adrenaline that you might be experiencing and kind of wear off a little bit of the adrenaline before you enter the test. Get to the exam on time, not too early, because if you arrive too early, it might create a situation where your anxiety just balloons. Avoid speaking with any fellow students who are not prepared or who express negativity. Be cautious of talking with other students about the exam material just before going into the exam, especially if the situation has made you nervous or confused in the past. And then acknowledge and prepare for reality. Just acknowledge the fact that there will be some stress. In fact, low amounts of stress induce better performance. So you have to acknowledge there will be stress, and that's fine, that's normal. There will most likely be some questions that catch you off guard. You'll probably experience difficulty recalling some material you studied, and recognize that while the test is very important, it by itself isn't going to ruin your life. If you don't pass it, life will go on and things will work out. What not to do when preparing for a test: don't start cramming for the first time the day before the test. Don't study with a group that's going to distract you. Don't study in a distracting environment. As some students think, I was studying all night, but they had the TV on, they had friends around, they were checking their phone. That's not really studying. Don't make review material that takes longer to make than it does to review. If you make these pretty flashcards, but you never actually review the flashcards, then they're kind of pointless. And then don't let social media distract you. Put the distraction far away from you, put your phone away, let it be a reward after a study session. Try not to study on an empty stomach. Okay, some other things to recognize are some triggers: visual triggers, auditory triggers when you're entering a testing environment. Some visual triggers for some students are students getting up and turning in their tests might trigger some anxiety. Maybe the room becoming more and more empty, people turning their pages of their exams gives you anxiety. The clock that you look at and you can see that it's ticking away. Auditory triggers, maybe people, their pencils dropping on the table, backpacks being zipped up, desks moving around, the sound of the clock ticking, the door opening and closing as people leave. That all can trigger extra anxiety. Here are some possible solutions. Choose your seat wisely. You might sit in front so you can't see what people are doing behind you. You might avoid the temptation to look up. Don't look at the clock. Stay focused on the exam in front of you. Sit away from a window so that you're not distracted by the outside. So make sure you're recognizing what your trigger is, if you have one, and get a solution that will work for you. With the auditory triggers, I think using earplugs is a great idea, or sitting by a fan or vent that can drown out some sounds. You could possibly talk to your instructor about listening to, some quiet music in some headphones, but that would be up to the instructor. Here's some sources that I took from, if you'd like to look for extra information on preparing for tests. These all have great ideas. Let's go to part 3 during the test. What can we do now that we're sitting inside the test and we start to experience some anxiety? Start to recognize some internal triggers. Recognize every time a negative thought creeps into your head and stop the negative talk. Remember, the purpose of your brain is to keep you safe, so that anxiety is normal. It might start to make some exaggerations. It might start to make some predictions in your brain that all have negative connotations with them. And our job is to stop that from happening. So if you find yourself thinking any of these things, I want to graduate college, you start thinking of the consequences of failing, you start thinking about the time limit, you start thinking about how much brighter the other students are. Those are all those negative thoughts that are going to trigger anxiety. If you start to feel your heart pounding, rapid breath, knot in your stomach, headaches, dizziness, those are all physical feelings that are triggering the anxiety, that are coming from your feelings, coming from those negative thoughts. So some strategies for ending negative thoughts. Is your thought a true statement? You have to ask yourself, is my life really going to be ruined if I fail this test? Most likely not. You have to remind yourself of your positive work you've done to prepare for the exam and the work you're putting into combating your anxiety. Start to repeat some normalizing statements to yourself. You can say, I'm prepared for this. I can handle this situation. I've handled this situation before. This feeling is normal. Anxiety is normal. I'm in control. I'm going to focus on my strengths. Focus on the things you've done to prepare and the body of knowledge you've developed. Those with test anxiety let the emotions interrupt and clutter their pathways. They let those negative thoughts stop their brain from thinking. They lose their confidence. They doubt their intelligence. Their brain freezes on the things they need to remember. The brain continues to push the negative thoughts in. And so you can't think because your brain stopped moving along the pathways that it's supposed to be moving along. Those without test anxiety, they still get stuck on tests. It doesn't mean that they're acing the test, but when they get stuck, they might try to make sense of the wording, or they might recall from memory, the memory bank, the right formula or the approach. If they're stuck, they rethink, reread, they return to the memory bank, they let their brain keep moving along the pathways that it's supposed to be moving along without getting frozen. So the essence of doing math in this anxiety situation is to not stop, but keep on going. So here's some ideas to keep that brain moving. Active thinking. You have to try new paths of thought. If one path isn't working for you during a test, try a new path. Again, self-monitor. Recognize when your panic's starting so that you can stop the brain from the negative thoughts. Give yourself permission to be confused. Remind yourself it's normal. Even people without anxiety are confused in tests. But continue to let your brain to move by writing down thoughts, calculations, problem-solving steps, etc. And then writing things down is what is going to help master this. Remember to write something down, because the thinking in math involves doing. Thinking in math involves doing. If we're trying to keep it all up in our head, a lot of times it'll freeze or it'll get cluttered. So write it down. That'll help your brain continue to move. So here's some test taking strategies to remember, because when you're prepared, you're confident. And when you have a strategy, you are comfortable. Look over the entire test to get a sense of the length. Start with the problems that you know for sure how to do, because it'll build your confidence. It'll also make sure that if you run out of time, that at least you got the points that you knew what you're doing, those problems you knew what you're doing on. When you get your test, see if you can write down your formulas that you need to remember on the top. Show all your work. That means your instructor can see what you've done and make sure that they can easily read it, because a lot of times instructors can assign partial credit based on the work that you show. Try to never leave a problem blank. You never want to leave a problem blank, because leaving a blank is for sure 0 points on that problem. And at least if you show something, you're keeping your brain moving, and it's possible points you can earn. Make sure you read the questions carefully and do all the parts of the problems. Never waste time erasing. I thought this was a good one that I didn't know as a student. Just draw a line through your work that you want to ignore, because erasing wastes precious time, but also you might later need the work that you wrote down or realize that it was correct, and having it there might be beneficial later on. Don't give up on a several part problem just because you don't know how to do the first part. You might know how to figure out the next part. Verify your answers, especially if you have time at the end. And if you finish, again, check every problem. That usually means reworking it from scratch. And with the verify your answers, make sure they make sense in the context of the problem. That's a good way to catch mistakes. Okay, lastly, I'm just going to show you a few student samples to model what you can do to keep your brain moving while using some of the test taking strategies I mentioned earlier. So here's a student who kept the brain moving and didn't waste time erasing. To some, this might look really sloppy, but to this student, it worked because they didn't waste time erasing. They wrote notes to the teacher indicating how they tested different values and which ones worked. So in fact, they wrote B up here. They circled A. So on a normal test, the teacher probably wouldn't give that correct, but because they showed all their work and the teacher could see that they were understanding the process of how to solve this type of an equation, they got most, if not all, of the points because their work was shown. Attempt all parts on a several part problem. Here's a student who got 0 points on the first part. They didn't use the right formula, but they displayed sound reasoning and showed all works for part B and C. So they got full credits for those parts because their reasoning was correct, even though it was based on the incorrect part A that they did incorrectly. This is a kind of a long problem, so don't worry about reading it all the way through, but this student got parts A correct, but not parts B and C. As they reflected on their answer, they knew it didn't make sense. Teachers love when students recognize if their answer doesn't make sense. It means you're thinking mathematically, you're looking at the context of the problem. And so this student got 0.5 out of 4 on that part because they recognized that this amount of interest over 35 years was way too small. $4.16 was way too small amount of interest on part C. And so oftentimes instructors would love to see you reflect on your answer. Here's another one where the student actually didn't reflect on their answer. So this was a one-time deposit of $5,000. After 5 years, they said it would turn into $4 million, $4,311,000. So it should raise a red flag because it's a very large number. This student did not reflect on their answer, so they did not get any points. They used the wrong formula, but they probably could have got a partial credit if they had recognized, or they may have gone back and fixed their mistake if they had recognized that that answer was way too large. Write in formulas instead of leaving a problem blank. So this student got the problem wrong, probably because they typed it in their calculator incorrectly, but they actually showed the correct formula to use, and so they got partial points. If they had just written the answer without any formula there, they would have got 0 out of 5. Because they wrote the formula, they got 3 out of 5, because the instructor could see they did everything correctly with the setup. It was just in typing it in the calculator that was wrong. Here's another one, write formulas instead of leaving the problem blank. This student got part B wrong, but wrote the correct formula that it was to be used, so they got some partial points. Again, they didn't get the correct standard deviation, but they wrote the correct formula. Display any knowledge you have on the subject to keep your brain moving. This student didn't correctly know how to find the standard deviation, but related it to another topic she did know. So she got partial credit for showing her knowledge on how they related. 1 out of 6, not all the points, but they got partial credit. Plus they kept their brain moving, and probably on the next question that asked them about Z-score, that brain was already moving towards that topic and they knew how to do that. So those are some examples. That's where my video will end. I hope it was helpful for you and you had some takeaways you could take to help yourself with any anxiety you might experience. And good luck in your next test.